All set?
All right, yep.
Okay.
All right, Ryan, welcome everyone to Phoenixville Library. I'm Mark Pinto, Adult Services Director here, and we are pleased to have back with us tonight Ryan Conroy, a local historian fresh off his ghost tour of the library and vicinity a few weeks ago. And tonight, the ghosts of World War I captured in his photography collection is the subject of tonight's program. So thanks everyone for coming, and welcome Ryan.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for coming tonight. And like Mark said, we did an event here at the end of October for the first time, and it looks like it's probably going to happen next year.
Yeah.
It was a nice fundraiser for the library. We kind of did it around Halloween, and we did some of the famous ghost stories here at the Phoenixville Library. Did a little walking tour downtown and went down to Ann's Heart. And had some refreshments down there. It was a good time, and so stay tuned for that for next year. And I mean, it sold out in like a week and a half. There's like 150 people, like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're like, yeah, it might need to be 2 days or something next week, next year. So, yeah. But yeah. So tonight's talk is about World War I U.S. photography, and it sounds like a kind of a broad subject, but we're gonna talk about some of the process of the photography, about the story behind some of the images that I'm going to show, and kind of give you guys an idea of like maybe a little more of a personal look at these soldiers and based around photography. I love photography. That's why I do this talk, and I started collecting. I collect all different formats of photography, but I started collecting World War I U.S. photography seriously for about 20 years now, so I have accumulated. Literally, I have in my personal collection, I have probably over 2,500 original personalized photographs. Nothing, non-mass produced. In other words, we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. So you guys are going to get to see some of my personal collections, never been published before, and I will talk about some of the images. So I always like to start my talk off with my favorite photo that I have in my entire collection. The reason why it is my favorite photo is because this is my great-grandfather, and that's his brother, my great-great-uncle. That is what got me interested in World War I. And I actually had been collecting for years. Literally, probably about 15 of those years, I was seriously collecting photography before I even got this photo, ironically. This is a really neat photo to start. It's a beautiful photograph. It's very clear. They had this photograph taken in France in 1919. This was taken, of course, after the war had ended. The two of them, they were brothers. They were actually in two completely separate units. They never saw each other during the entire war, but they would write letters to each other all the time. And I actually, luckily, also have those letters. But they would write to each other all the time, and they always talk about how they could try and like meet up with each other. And what do you know? After the war had ended, they actually were able to meet up and get this photograph taken. So it's really cool. It's the first time they probably had seen each other in almost 2 years.
Do you think that's deliberate that they were separated?
Yes and no. I mean, they actually at that time it was still common to have siblings in the same company. And I'll talk about that probably a little bit because Phoenixville definitely was primed for that, because if you had a company of the National Guard within a small town, and Phoenixville had two, so therefore you had existing members, and you had siblings and relatives and neighbors and all that stuff, all people from the same town still existing in a unit in World War I. World War II, of course, it changed dramatically, and they purposely didn't do that. Well, they learned that from a lot of that had to do with World War I, because you'd have a whole company, in the war. And Phoenixville, prime example, both of those companies served in the 28th Division, and that division was in some of the most combat in World War I. So you had these full companies of over 150 men that were fighting, and they were in so much combat, they had over 50% casualties. So you're talking about siblings, both of them dying during the war at the same time. Neighbors, business owners, everybody in town. So it was more of a direct effect, like what you're getting at, and that's why they changed that. Right towards kind of the beginning time period of World War II to prevent something like that from happening.
That's why I asked.
Yep. So, but at that time they just randomly were in just two different units. They both volunteered and they were put into. He was in a completely different unit. He was actually in a motorcycle dispatch unit, and he was actually in an engineer regiment. So they doing completely different things. So speaking of Phoenixville, right towards right before World War I started, we were gearing up towards something much smaller, which was called the Mexican Border Campaign in 1916, and that's when we were sending down U.S. troops down to the borders of Texas and Mexico to try and track down Pancho Villa. And it was a very unusual action for the U.S. military at the time. It was something you actually don't hear a lot about. There was combat, there was guys that died, and there was actually both units from Phoenixville actually went down to the Mexican border, and there wasn't a lot of units that went down. Okay, there was a lot of regular U.S. Army, but then there was both companies from Phoenixville actually wound up going down there. This you can see very clearly marked on the bottom in memory of the homecoming of Battery C from the border of Mexico. And this photograph, anybody know where that's taken?
Reed's Park.
Reed's Park, right? You can see the band shell, right? You can actually see there's Reed's statue.
And the gazebo on the
original gazebo, all the original benches, right? The original benches that were throughout the park. This is right at the front entrance. You're right in front of you. You have the arch. And this is a Boy Scout troop. That was taken. The guy in the back was a priest from St. Mary's.
Do you know what troop that is?
I don't. I forget what the number. It was one of the original. It's the one that still exists today.
58.
Yeah.
That's the troop.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this photograph is really it's the only one I've ever seen. This was taken. But the Mexican Border Campaign was kind of almost like a real precursor to the soldiers going into World War I. A lot of the guys that were already in the unit wound up. They were still in the unit because the National Guard, of course, at the time was treated as a home guard unit, and so they were still in the unit. And World War I starts, and then all of a sudden they're back in it again, which was something that was a change during World War I because you had what would be deemed as a home guard type of unit, but now these guys are being put into full blown combat. So you had guys in the unit that were like in their 50s and 60s even, and they're like, well, so they actually started to try and replace a couple of them before they went over to France, and so big change, so quick between just about a year and a half. So this is a photograph that was taken in 1917 of one of the Phoenixville companies marching up Bridge Street to Columbia Station at the Reading Railroad to get on the train to go to where they did their training in 1917 in Augusta, Georgia, is where the 28th Division was before they went over to France. And it's just a great photograph. This is actually blown up from a snapshot, probably about that big. It's a personalized photograph, so this is not a mass-produced photo. This was taken by somebody in the crowd. It's just a really cool shot. And one thing is really interesting, especially about Phoenixville during the war, was at that time in 1917, Phoenixville really consisted of what would by that time a full melting pot of people. Okay, so during the Civil War, you still had very strictly mostly Irish and Germans in Phoenixville. And then by World War I, 1917, you had most of the Eastern European immigrants here existing in Phoenixville, along with some of those old families. And what's really cool is before the U.S. was even involved in the war, this was taken in about 1914, and this is from a glass plate negative. This is Bridge Street here, right? Here's Avlos, the Greek restaurant. Looks exactly the same. That building hasn't changed. And here's the corner, right? Fun fact: that building is actually one of the oldest existing buildings on Bridge Street. It kind of is not like the most obvious thing ever, but that building was built in 1837. It's actually one of the oldest still standing buildings on Bridge Street. And then right here, these are all still here. And you can see the sign here. It says Polish Army in France Recruiting Station. And then here it's actually in Polish. And so they were actually recruiting in Phoenixville for Polish immigrants that were living here at the time to actually enlist in the Polish Army and send them over before the U.S. was even involved. That was not uncommon. So you had that in Phoenixville with the Polish, the Italians, Hungarians, and then and Ukrainians, absolutely, yep, and then also Germans. So that was very, very common at the time before the U.S. Obviously, once the U.S. declared war on Germany, that stopped. But there was a lot of Polish. I even had a relative that was living in Phoenixville at the time who had lived in Phoenixville already for about 10 plus years, who actually enlisted in the Polish Army and was a Polish officer in World War I. Those people were supported directly by Holy Trinity Church and the Polish Club. Polish Club were the precursor to the Polish Club, because the Polish Club didn't exist yet, but you had fraternal organizations, and they actually raised money and paid for them to get over there. So just a really interesting little tidbit that you don't hear a lot about.
So they went over as U.S. citizens?
Not necessarily. So some of them might have been citizens yet, but then a lot of them weren't. It was super common at that time for people not to become U.S. citizens for like 40 years. I'll give you my perfect example. I'm a melting pot of people, but my family that's from Phoenixville were from Poland, and they came here in 1903, and they didn't become U.S. citizens until for another 20 years. Yeah, so that was really, really common. Yeah, so some of them could have been, and then some of them might not have been. But there was probably, they would throw in some deals, here and there, like, hey, if you're going to go over there, you're going to do this. Now, perfect example, if they actually enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1917, then they would have been made U.S. citizens. And that's why there were so many immigrants in the U.S. Army, because it was an enticing thing. You're guaranteed U.S. citizenship on the spot if you sign those papers. That happened during the Civil War. Same exact thing. Yeah, World War II that happened. This Polish thing actually happened during World War II as well. Yep, big time. Once again, before the U.S. was involved in the war, they had the war going on for years before the U.S. was involved, and the same exact thing happened. This is a man that was actually from Phoenixville. That one they were in Georgia. It was called Camp Hancock, where they did their training, and he was in the 111th Infantry. Their armory building is right down here on Main Street, which is the old Civic Center. So that's where the 111th Armory building is, and the Battery C building is over off of Buchanan Street. And unfortunately, this year, the borough tore down the original Battery building, and some of the buildings that were on the left side, those were all the original horse stables for the horse-drawn artillery. So there's like nothing left of the armory building. But this man, his last name was McHugh, and he was from the north side of Phoenixville, and he enlisted in the 111th, goes overseas, and in August of 1918, he actually winds up getting exposed to a gas attack, gets exposed to gas and dies during the war. Yeah. This is he was a lieutenant in the same company. His name was Theron Keenan, and he was also from Phoenixville, and he was one of the commanding officers of the company. He was with the unit the entire war and somehow survived all the major conflicts they were in, and so that's a very clear photograph. As you can see the difference there. One thing that people ask a lot about, because I get like photos, and people a lot of times, it's hard to tell sometimes the difference between number one, where was the photo taken, okay, which can sometimes be tricky, and is the photo like a mass-produced photo, or was it like an individual photograph that was just a one-time and done type of thing? And you will commonly find a lot of mass-produced photos during World War I because postcards themselves were extremely popular. So you had this combination of two things that were happening at once, which is what's really interesting about World War I photography is the format itself were generally dominated by what we call real photo postcards. So it was an actual photograph, but printed on a postcard stock. Okay, so the postcard process was, during World War I, besides the photo thing, postcards were popular. This is when so many of the postcards of Phoenixville were being done, including several of the library. Right, there was multiple library ones done, and because postcards were so popular from a short period of time, before World War I and even a little after World War I, they actually estimated there were millions of postcards that were shipped and sent, because you just put a stamp on it and you can send it. It could either be a photograph or it could be a mass-produced postcard like one of the Phoenixville Library. Now, when you're trying to identify the back of a photograph, now specifically with U.S. military World War I, you can actually tell from the back of the postcard where it was printed without it saying anything. And that is because see these lines, okay, on the backs of the photographs. Sometimes these lines on the backs of the photographs can tell you that the photograph was actually taken in Germany. And that was a common thing, that the photo postcards on the backs of U.S. soldiers usually didn't have the name postcard on the back in German. A lot of times it was a blank back like this with lines on it, nothing on it, not even a spot for a stamp. But you could mail this, all right? So, but things you're going to see, you will see soldiers generally, sometimes actually physically mailing the photographs home, but a lot of times they were like, wait, this is a nice photograph. So they would actually not mail the actual photograph by itself. They would actually put it inside an envelope and then put a stamp on it, like this would have been. Okay. Now you can see this one's kind of crazy. This one's actually in Russian on the top here, and then right here at the bottom, for some reason, it's in French. But this was actually taken in Siberia. As a World War I doughboy had taken this, World War I sailor had this taken in March, you can see March 30th, 1918. And here he's addressing it, to somebody, but once again, this one was also not mailed through the system.
So that was during the occupation of Russia? It
was, you can see, Vladivostok, Russia. So in March of 1918, when we were over there in the Siberian expedition, is something you don't hear a lot about, and that was occurring during World War I, and after the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. We were actually there, and we're actually there fighting the Bolsheviks and the early communist stuff in Siberia into 1919. And you just don't hear about it a lot. It's a really interesting subject. There's a lot of
the
good
Russian Revolution was 1917.
Yeah. So you had the Russian Revolution happening. There's a lot of stuff going on at that time, and it was just this, the U.S. weren't the only troops there. It was almost kind of like an early UN operation type of thing, because the U.S. troops were fighting with the British. They were fighting with Eastern European units, all kinds of all kinds of interesting stuff going on. It's really interesting. Here's one of the envelopes. Now this was actually here in the United States, but you can see this is taken by a camp photographer. He's talking about price and if you paid a deposit, what's due, and things like that. You might actually have your unit on there, or how many copies of the image that you wanted. And here's something that you would put that photograph in the envelope and mail it. And this one is the one you're going to see usually, let's say, the most, I'd say. But this one is a really classic, World War I U.S. real photograph that was taken in France. You know, so like they were actually getting photographs taken. Luckily, sometimes they could actually, believe it or not, get studio photographs taken during the war, depending on where they were stationed at. And then you're going to see a ton of them being taken after the armistice is signed. The war's over, and the U.S. military occupied major cities in France, including Paris. So it was like a free-for-all. Yeah, everybody was getting their photographs taken in all these studios. And one easiest way ever to tell the back of where it was taken on those is it's always going to say carte postale on the back, meaning it's a postcard mark for France. And that is going to be common. This is a pretty rare photograph that I have about 5 different images of, and I actually don't have the prints. I have the original negatives, and which is kind of even rarer. So this is actually a super rare photograph taken really early in the war. This is before we were actually declared war on Germany. We had a lot of volunteers here in the United States that volunteered for the American ambulance units, and those units were directly supporting the French. And mind you, we were going over there doing this before we were declared war on Germany. This was occurring as early as 1915. So this is a couple of years this was going on before we were yet actually technically involved in the war. This was not uncommon for U.S. citizens to do this type of thing. Go up to Canada and enlisting Canadian units just so they could fight the Germans, which we weren't even technically declared war on yet.
But did the United States government not sponsor, but did they allow it?
They allowed it.
Yeah.
They allowed it. A lot of these American ambulance units were self-sponsored. Sometimes they were, some of the, depending on what units they were, some of the units were actually completely recruited out of colleges. And they volunteered. It's a full volunteer thing. It was like almost became like a popular thing to do because there was very famous people that volunteered for the American ambulance units, including Ernest Hemingway, Walt Disney, like all these people at the time. It was a thing to do. Now it wasn't like something easy to do. They were going over there and they were driving these ambulances on front lines. And this was because they were so desperate for help. The French were desperate for help. And so you'll see these designations on this, American Ambulance Field Service. And you can see the French and the American flag here. And this is the unit, SSU number 16. And everything was identified on these little ambulances. And this is the driver here. As you can see, he is not wearing a regulated U.S. military uniform in this photograph. They actually created their own uniforms, the American Field Service, and they had their own insignia on their hats. The stuff is extremely rare to find. It's extremely collectible, and I was lucky to find these negatives.
I saw one near Pittsburgh at a military show.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. He was selling it for like nearly $1,000.
Yeah, I believe it. So you can see a couple of the other ambulances in the back. They're all numbered. They're all numbered separately.
But the background is France.
That's in France.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now later on, when we were in the war, we had U.S. Medical units and U.S. ambulance units that were that were actually officially designated as part of the U.S. military. And here's a shot of one of those units, very clearly marked with the Red Cross on the front, and he's wearing an American military uniform, of course. So one of my favorite parts about collecting World War I photographs is there's a lot of very unusual, funny stuff. This format of photography was new, okay? It was newer. You still were kind of on the cusp of being able to take personal photographs. So you had Kodak putting out pocket cameras at the time that you could carry and take personal photographs and they would be on small snapshot form. But it still wasn't super readily available to everybody. It was expensive. So so you're still going to see this format of studio photography and even the outdoor photography being very formal and posed. And it's very much similar to Civil War photographs, right? There's a very big connection between the two, where it was kind of this, you know, I'll say a lull. There was a lot of developments in photography between those periods, but the actual like process itself, like this type of stuff, is very similar. And this would change. We're pretty close after World War I had ended, because now Kodak specifically was really developing a lot of personalized cameras, making them cheaper and more affordable. And you know, George Eastman was a genius, and he really made that us as an everyday. Of course, now we're walking around with cell phones and take a million photographs.
The guy on the right, the second one on the right has a smartphone.
No, yeah, he's taking a phone. So you will see all kinds of weird stuff, and this is a good one where this guy is literally pretending to be dead. It's just his friend. They're just goofing around, but he's literally pretending to be dead here. And yeah, these guys are holding knives. He's pretending to be a priest here, reading a little testament. This guy, that's a BAR, if you know your weapons. Yeah, right? So there's a lot of like that kind of stuff. If you collect World War I photographs, just something so small like that will boost the value in the photograph, because you know, photographs of BARs in the field at the time is a newer invention when it comes to weaponry. So like any photographs that you can find of them in the field will make the photo more valuable.
Barely any shotguns.
Yeah. Yes.
The guy was kneeling. What are all those things that he has on his belt?
That's a web belt. So that's where he would have had all his ammo clips for his rifle. Yeah.
Very interesting how his pistol set up there.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's all kinds of stuff. This guy's pretending that he smells. Like there's a lot of stuff going on in this photo. It's kind of crazy.
Did so long.
Yeah.
Maybe the priest is reading the last rites.
Yeah. And then you get to the complete opposite of that, where you have guys that were actually wounded. This photograph was taken in studio right after the war had ended. And he obviously had an arm wound here. He had something going on where he needed this cane. So it was really common to go to the studio and get a photograph of yourself showing your wounds. This is also a very Civil War thing to do. Just a really interesting photograph. Both of these soldiers are identified on the back of the image, and they're both identified also to the 28th Infantry Division. You know, staying in format with our medical theme here, this is a beautiful photograph of 3 volunteer Red Cross nurses. And just a very typical outfit and uniform for them. And of course, American Red Cross were all volunteers still at the time, and was very, very big during World War I. And there was Red Cross units that were from Phoenixville that actually did go over to France. There's actually a World War I nurse that was from Phoenixville that was actually killed in action. She's buried at Mars Cemetery.
Looks like that flag is so annoying.
Yeah, so this is actually like a big souvenir thing, probably made out of felt, and she just probably had it pinned on here for something with the photograph. It doesn't go with the uniform. It's just a, hey, look, this is neat type of thing. Now these women are U.S. Army nurses. So they were volunteers. They were enlisted, and they were all officers. And so this is a very formal portrait, and you can see. There's a lot of things with uniforms, and that if you have photographs at home of family or whatever, World War I, look at the sleeves, look at a lot of things that are going on. These patches are all Third Army patches, okay? And these little things here, those were all little insignias that show how long you were overseas. Yeah, this still exists today, right, in the U.S. military. But during World War I, those actually meant 3 months. And that changed later on as going through World War II. You didn't see the full; they were more little slashes. But 3 month service, and you can have as many on there as you wanted. But obviously, with the U.S. military, not going over to France until 1917, you're not going to see a ton of them. But some of the early units that went over there, you will see sometimes like a decent chunk of them, but it's not really that common.
So are they enlisted?
Yes, they are.
They're enlisted.
They're enlisted volunteer, and so when they went into the U.S. military as U.S. Army nurses, and to go into, to be an Army nurse, of course, you were automatically an officer. Yeah. Oops. Another thing that women were very, very well known for and did as a volunteer service was the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army was also very, very, very big during World War I. All the towns consisted of Salvation Army units, and the Salvation Army, they would actually, so these were women and men that were also in the Salvation Army, mostly women, that would actually volunteer to go over to France and serve on the front lines. And what were they very well known for was making donuts. There's a lot of theories. There's so many theories about the name, where the name doughboys come from. Sometimes they actually think that there's actually some documentation of the word doughboy being used during the American Revolution, but they're not. No one's 100% sure. But the term doughboy during World War I is when it really just exploded. It was doughboy everything, and they think sometimes that name also possibly came from the donut thing, and that English units were calling them doughboys because the donut thing was a very American thing, and you got these women back there with these field kitchens making donuts, what the heck is that? Well, obviously the American soldiers loved it, so it was very, very popular. This is also just a neat photograph. This is also scanned from an original negative. I have a grouping of a couple hundred negatives from an army for a volunteer YMCA woman. Now that was the other branch of service that you're going to see, also volunteer. All right, so the YMCA was huge also during that time period, and also all volunteer, and a lot of them served overseas. So this is a nice photograph here of a YMCA volunteer, all three of them. He is too. You can see his YMCA is actually on his collar insignia, and they were wearing U.S. military uniforms for the most part. And the women, sometimes you get all kinds of different combinations.
And what was his role?
He just would have been involved in whatever the YMCA was doing. They actually set up a giant YMCA headquarters in France. And they actually, believe it or not, they actually built buildings. That's how big the YMCA was. They actually built buildings just for the YMCA. And then they would set up YMCA huts and like near camps where they would be almost like a PX type of thing, where they would do everything that was needed. Of course, now Young Men's Christian Association, so it was always based around Christianity, and so one thing that was really popular was for them to give out testaments. Okay, they would have them printed and given them out to the soldiers, stationery, all that kind of stuff.
And they have some insignia on her hat.
Yeah, that actually says YMCA on those hats. Yep. One of my favorite styles to collect in World War I photography is photos of U.S. soldiers wearing all of their equipment in a studio. Okay, so it's a formal portrait. As you can see, this guy served in the 79th Infantry Division, which is what my great-grandfather was in, and he is literally wearing everything that he would have been wearing in the field on the march. This would have been his full gear. He got his extra pair of shoes. You can see the hobnails on the shoes on the back of this thing. That's his full pack. He's got all his web gear on, his gas mask. And his helmet, of course. And what's really interesting about some of these photographs too is that this is taken right after the war had ended, and you can usually tell from his face. Okay, so his face, he definitely has a little bit of a 1,000-yard stare going on in that photograph, and that sometimes you'll come across images where you can just tell immediately, you can just from their facial expressions.
How much did all that gear weigh?
It's a good question. I forget the total weight, but it was over 40 pounds.
It's nearly.
It's a lot.
60, I think.
I think it was somewhere around 60 pounds if you had everything
I've
on.
worn it. It's bad.
Yeah, it's heavy. This is another studio photograph, going back into like goofy combinations of things. Both these guys also served in the 28th Division. Just a really good studio format. One thing that you can tell sometimes when you study them enough is the props that are used in the studio, and sometimes you can tell from the props where the photograph was taken. You're able to track down studios, and but you're also sometimes able to track down you can tell what country it was taken from. This is a very German photograph. With anything that do with like mountains and forest and things, it's like the most German thing, right? So you got these pine trees in the back, and they got this wood thing that the photographer built. But these guys are wearing their uniforms with their gas masks, and they were both wearing captured German items. So he's wearing a helmet, he's wearing a German visor cap.
Is the dog German?
The dog is not German, that was their mascot. They actually wrote on the back. And here he says, Sherman was entirely too modest. And it's just a really cool photograph. It's just a neat photograph. They're both smiling. This guy drew on a mustache to look like he's German. This is obviously pre-Hitler, so it's not a Hitler mustache, but it eventually would be. This is a cool photograph. Sometimes you'll get, they were still using fake painted backdrops, very, very much so in World War I, and they were still using them they were using them in Vietnam. But this was very common in World War I, and sometimes a photographer might have been a little too far back, and you can still clearly see the backdrop and all the stuff around it. But it's a cool shot of guys. This is also another very Civil War type of thing to do, is take a formal portrait photograph of them gambling. They're playing cards. They got money in their hands. They got the playing cards on on the ground and stuff, and just a neat image. Backdrops, you're going to see all kinds of different stuff. Another common post-war, usually like after the war had ended, studio pose would have been a photo of them drinking. I have photos in my, to be honest with you, I have photos in my collection. They had clearly had several beers and by the time the photograph was taken. And sometimes it's a little more formal here with their little probably sherry glasses or something. And this is probably taken in France. It's definitely not a beer bottle. This is another photograph that if you didn't know, you would possibly think that these guys were Germans. But they're not. They're actually U.S. soldiers wearing a whole bunch of captured German stuff to the point where they actually look like German soldiers. This was super, super popular and common to do during World War I. The Americans are always known in most of the wars as being souvenir hunters. That is nothing new. It's nothing to be ashamed about. It's actually really cool. And they were very big on that during World War I, especially with weaponry. To get your hands on a World War I German Luger was quite a prize.
Is that a monocle?
Yeah, he's wearing a monocle. This guy's literally trying to be like this German officer. He's got like a cigarette holder and
There's in New York there's pyramids of pickle holders and the spiked ones.
Yeah, yep. So these guys, there's a German helmet here. They both have hats on. This guy, that's a German holster. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. Just another good example. And here's another one that's a little funnier. This guy's got his gun pointed right at this guy's head for some reason. That is a U.S. military 45.
With a cigarette.
With a cigarette. These guys are also 79th Division, but you got all kinds of stuff. That's a German helmet. That's a French helmet. That's a French helmet. That's a German helmet. And so these guys are just goofing around. There's pistols in almost all of their hands. And just another funny image. And they like their stuff so much that after they came back, this photograph is taken in the United States. This is from a snapshot where he set up his collection of captured stuff to take a photograph. Probably take his wife. Probably, hey mom, hey either mom or hey, get his wife to take a picture of him, pose with all this. He's got a lot of stuff there. I mean, he's got full clips of ammo. He's got grenades that are probably not deactivated. Little signs. I guarantee you, those were taken out of trenches. And
Looks like a 3-inch artillery shell.
yeah, so you got some pretty big stuff going on there. German belt. There's his helmet, and then of course there's a German helmet there. He's got posed with his gas mask. That was a really popular thing to do.
The dress belt.
Yeah. So this guy's, like I said, proud of his stuff. We saw another doggy in the other photograph. That's another thing that I like to collect, and it was very, very popular. So, of course, units would adopt mascots, and they had all kinds of different animals. I have seen photographs of everything. But dogs, of course, were very popular. Dogs and cats. And this one, he obviously wanted to get his studio photograph taken with one of their mascots. This dog is cute. I don't know, he kind of almost looks like a little French bulldog or like a little Frenchie or something, but he's kind of different looking. But it's a cute photo. This guy served in the 82nd Infantry Division.
Not with those ears, so it's not a French bulldog.
No, I don't know what it is. I actually kind of looks like a little gremlin, but I'm not sure what it is. Sometimes you get, like I said, some really striking images, and this is one of them that I really, really like. I always picture this on the front cover of a book. Very, very formal, striking image of a U.S. soldier. Just wearing his regular enlisted uniform, got his helmet on, and once again, there's his gas mask, bag, but just a really nice photograph. And of course, photographs just like nowadays. Some people can take them and some people can't, right? And you had some excellent photographers in France at the time, and you had some that weren't that great. So sometimes you see photographs that are just much more impressive. You can tell that, hey, this photographer was an artist, clearly. So just a beautiful image. Another studio portrait here that going back to the Siberian expedition guys, right? This actually was taken in a studio in Siberia.
Wow.
And you could tell, number one, by the back of the photograph, but his uniform. He's wearing the uniform that was issued to him to the U.S. soldiers that were in Siberia. These were like crazy fur-lined jackets with a fur felt, a full-blown fur hat, fur mittens. They had mostly a lot of different type of gear. Obviously for the elements, they're in Siberia.
But with those mittens, what weapons?
So they probably would not have been able to fire their rifle with those heavy mittens. They did have trigger mittens. And it was actually, depending on what type there was actually rifles that were modified as well. The Germans did it first, but they actually would have rifles that had bigger trigger center, so you can actually get your hands in with wearing gloves.
Smith and Wesson?
Maybe, yeah, but you had German soldiers that were already fighting in the Eastern Front, and they adapted weaponry all over all across the board, and you will see stuff like that. Just another striking image, and this is of these are actually of two U.S. military Air Service guys. So this is before, of course, it was the Air Force. This is before it was the Army Air Corps. This is the Army Air Service, and so you had this guy here, clearly a pilot. He definitely has the swagger of a pilot. He's wearing a custom, tailor-made French uniform with a silver bullion wings. And he's a lieutenant. This guy's a captain. He also has custom-made uniform items as well. Something that obviously is very popular with World War I is the air service stuff. Pilots, World War I pilots, right? Eddie Rickenbacker and all the famous World War I pilots, which is the first time in American military that we had combat fighting. Dog fights. We had aces. And this was like huge. This was used frankly, this was used for propaganda. There was books and movies and all kinds of stuff that were coming out during the war. That, hey, here's this, famous ace pilot. Eddie Rickenbacker definitely was one that was utilized quite a bit. So collecting things from there, from that field of service is definitely not easy, and very expensive. So slowly it's taken me years to be able to get really good images of World War I pilots that were actually combat pilots, stuff that was taken overseas. It's more common to find World War I pilots taken here in the States that never actually went over to France. They're doing training down in Kelly Field, in Texas, and you will find way more images of World War I pilots that didn't serve in combat, because it's more common to find. And sometimes when you're collecting photographs, you will find, most of my collection consists of super common, U.S. enlisted privates. And then sometimes you'll find a rare photograph like this one, which now there's a copy of this photograph at the U.S. Marine Corps Museum. Because that guy right there is John Lejeune, one of the most famous Marines in Marine history. Lejeune was the commanding general of the Marine Corps during World War I. He also was already a highly decorated Marine before World War I even started. Okay, and so this photograph here these are all Marine officers here, and that's him right here in the center. You can see he's got tons of ribbons. There's a lot of stuff going on there from all kinds of oddball Marine stuff that was pre-World War I. So they were, some Mexican border type stuff. You had stuff that was in Haiti, you had stuff in Nicaragua, you had all kinds of crazy oddball stuff. He was in the Spanish-American War. He did all kinds of stuff. If you don't know who John Lejeune is, definitely look him up. I mean, there's a ton of books on him, and he's very famous. But sometimes you can find a photograph in the wild, like this one, which is extremely rare because it was never published. It was an unpublished photograph of one of the most famous Marines to ever exist. So it's definitely one of my better finds.
So Camp Lejeune is named after
Camp Lejeune is named after him, yep. Correct. This photograph is cool because this is actually, I think, the only one I have in the entire presentation that is not U.S. Okay, so this guy is actually German. This photograph was taken in 1916 in the heat of the war before the U.S. was involved. I like to put this photograph in here because this is actually a photograph of one of my other relatives that was actually in the German army. This is my great-great-uncle. And he was, he did not come to the United States until 1929. And when he immigrated here to the United States, my great-grandmother was already living here for 4 years. And he came directly from Bavaria right to Spring City. And my family were German shoemakers in Germany, and so when he came here, he opened up a shoe shop in Spring City that was open into the late '60s, early '70s. But before that, he actually enlisted in the German army and served from 1915 to 1918, and somehow survived. So being in the German army for that stretch of period, he fought in most of the major battles during World War I, and he was a machine gunner. And somehow he survived the war. I actually got this photograph only a couple years ago, and I have the original now for my family. But this is a formal studio portrait of him, and this insignia right here is actually a machine gunner qualification patch. So he is actually wearing it. It's a beautiful patch that was actually felt, and the actual pieces, unlike American patches, is actually felt, and that's actually metal. So it's felt with metal on and gold and silver bullion around the edges. He lived until 1961, and once he came to the United States, he obviously never talked about that too much, but it was very common for that type of thing to happen. It was also very common for U.S. citizens, especially in this area. Southeastern Pennsylvania, obviously the biggest populations of backgrounds is German, by far, right? You have Pennsylvania German history, which is our entire area, and some of those people were, they actually, even if their families were here for 100 and some years, it was not uncommon for them to actually volunteer and go over to Germany and fight for the German army, because they weren't fighting America at the time; they were fighting France and Italy and stuff like that. So it wasn't frowned upon, Then when the U.S. declares war in 1917, they're like, all right, yeah, you can't do that anymore. Yeah. But he was also my family was also very proud of their German background, because like on his business card, he actually had on there German American shoemaker. That was like his slogan.
And what was taken in Germany?
That was taken in Germany before he came here. His name was Joseph Kern.
What unit, do you know the specific unit?
I do. I have it at home. Yeah.
Was it a Sturmtruppen or just a normal?
I forget. I forget what unit he was with, but yeah, I have it at home. But he fought in pretty much every major conflict that the German army was in the Eastern Front, or Western Front, I mean. This photograph was also taken in the field, and this was actually taken, believe it or not, this was actually taken during the war. So the war wasn't over yet. So it's not super common to find in the field frontline images like this, because it wasn't safe for the photographer to go out there. But they did at times. They did at times, and this is an artillery unit posed in front of their defense here. You can see this is a trench line here, and there's an artillery piece right in there. They're all posed there, got their gas masks on, their helmets, and all their field gear and such. Just a very clear
That's
image.
one unit.
That would have been one battery, probably partial. It wouldn't have been a full battery. This would have been just for that artillery piece, a section.
Doesn't have a helmet.
Yeah, this guy's wearing like a knit hat.
Yeah.
Yeah, this guy has his hat, his
Some-
stuff off here. Yeah,
Some
and this
of
guy's
them-
got an overseas cap. Yep.
Yeah.
Some of them look British actually. If you look at the buttons, some of the buttons.
Yeah. Yeah, they're probably wearing British contract uniforms, because it was not uncommon for the U.S. troops that were there to be issued British-made uniforms. So you will see that fairly often. One of the units that you will see that the most of, and it was actually a purposeful thing, unfortunately, was the African American divisions that were in France, the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. The 93rd Division, Pershing actually refused to put the 93rd Division attached with other American troops because they were black. So they actually fought with the French, but they were American military, and they wore their patch. That's why their patch is actually a black patch with a blue helmet, and it's a blue Adrian helmet, a blue French helmet.
Wow.
They were actually wearing French helmets.
Wow.
They were actually wearing French gear because the American military weren't giving them proper gear because they were African American.
How many African Americans fought in World War I?
A lot. I mean, you get 2 full division, which is tens of thousands. Oh, it was a lot, and they were extremely significant and fought in some of the most combat in World War I. Some of the absolute best units. One of the most famous World War I units ever were the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry. They were literally recruited and mostly based all out of Harlem, and they had all kinds of famous jazz musicians like in the units. It's a fascinating unit, they were in a ridiculous amount of combat, and the Germans were deathly afraid of them because they were so good, and that's where they got the name Harlem Hellfighters, because no one wanted a piece of them. In other words, because they were very highly decorated and everything, and even to the U.S. military being very didn't want to give them medals, pretty much, but they had to because these guys were just they were insanely good, and there were so many guys in those units that should have been given Medal of Honors, and they weren't. There was one that was posthumously given a Medal of Honor a couple years ago. And this guy was one of the most famous guys in the unit. If you read his accounts and what he did, you're like, oh my God. Yeah, and he was just given one. Another photograph that was actually taken in the field, snapshot form. So this is taken by another soldier. And you can see there's debris all over the place. There's weapons there's helmets. There's mess gear all over the place. There's a little crater shell foxhole, and these two guys here are posed in the pose. And the photograph is interesting because on the back of the image itself, written in pencil, it says, Hill 231, just after we fought the Germans. And so that kind of stuff is extremely rare in any format. Really, even going into later wars. For a GI to be carrying around a personalized camera to take pictures of while they're getting shot at is not super common, but you will find them. That is, it does happen. I have a couple really good World War II ones that are some of my absolute favorite ones that were taken by guys that were in Germany, and they're little snapshots, and they're fascinating because you can see that the guy's clearly on the ground, and he's taking a shot, and there's like a little wall in front of him, and then you can see like puffs of smoke behind the wall. And literally in ink, he says, "At this time, we were getting shot at by a German sniper," and so they're like full blown combat photographs.
Would they have been reprimanded for having that camera?
Yeah, you were definitely not supposed to do that.
Right.
You were not supposed to do that, but
Okay.
you will
The other
definitely.
way.
Yeah. This one also was taken out in a field, but they fought a lot of combat in little French villages all over the place. And this is just taken, really, rustic, probably a centuries old, French building, and you can see the wall behind them. And these guys were just, fresh out of something that had just occurred. They all got, showing off their gas masks as usual, and just a neat image. I actually, sometimes what's really fun about collecting the photographs is sometimes you can reunite images, and sometimes it happens. It's just down the road. But I actually had this photograph for years, and I knew another World War I photo collector who had listed some of the photos out of his collection to sell some to obviously buy something else. But he put them on there, and then there was another photograph of the same guys from a different angle. And I was like, wait a second, those are my guys. So then I emailed him, I'm like, and he's like, oh dude, I have 2 more. So I wound up getting 3 more photographs of the same guys posed in different things. Yeah, all taken about the same time. Of course, sometimes you had, more solemn images that would have been taken. Now, this doughboy here, you had a photograph that's a formal portrait that was taken here in the United States before he went overseas, and then he wound up getting killed in action in France, and then so these 2 images came together. This one here, and then this one here of his grave in France, and so you will definitely see that when the U.S. military were establishing cemeteries in. Mostly during World War I, most of them were located, in France or some in Belgium, of course. They would actually take a formal photograph. The U.S. military would take a formal photograph of the grave, and then send that home with other documentation to the families. And then it was up to the families to decide to leave the soldier there in the American military cemetery, or they could say, hey, I want to bring them home and bury them here in Phoenixville at Mara Cemetery. And it was obviously paid for by the government, but it was up to the families. And some families said, no, I want them to stay there, that's where they died. And another family said, no, I want them home. And that's, Phoenixville is littered with soldiers for World War I and World War II and Vietnam that were killed in action, that were eventually brought home, and they're buried in Mara Cemetery, Holy Trinity Cemetery, and so they're all over the multiple different cemeteries, and you're going to see it's not uncommon, but there's obviously thousands upon thousands that are still over in France. Another really fun format of photography that was, kind of at the forefront of development of photography was aerial photography. Okay, and you would have either had to have taken this from a stationary biplane, or from a balloon, an observation balloon, that would have had to have been still enough for you to be able to get this image. Okay, this is not easy to do at that time. Definitely using a large format photograph. We started doing aerial combat photography during World War I with large format cameras that were actually mounted on the planes. And if you ever know the development of combat aerial photographs, even used during World War II, but they actually developed cameras that could actually snap an image between the propellers in combat. It was like, it's amazing, and they were actually custom made. So you had custom made planes, especially during World War II, that were actually made specifically to do that.
Well, in World War II, they had machine guns that used to do that too.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. So this is a aerial photograph taken of the 1st Field Artillery Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division. This was taken in Germany in 1919. You will see these being done mostly, generally, the original ones are about this big. And then they would take that print and make small prints where the soldiers could then buy them as souvenirs. So something like this, you might see thousands of this image in all kinds of oddball formats, because you could take that home to a photo studio here in America and be like, hey, make me some copies of this. You could do that at the time. So this is something that would be a good example of a mass-produced photograph. Now, a mass-produced format photograph like this is still going to have value, because it's not still the most common thing you're going to find. Yeah, of course, and these are all soldiers posed to form the 1st Infantry Division insignia. You will see this with other units. 2nd Division, the 3rd Division, and all kinds of different units you're going to see this with.
And how are they white?
They were actually just wearing white shirts.
Oh.
Yep, they're all just wearing white shirts.
They use that same format to do flags,
Yeah.
the United States flag.
They still do that now. They still do that kind of stuff now. Yeah. Another, we talked about a little bit about some of the marine photograph, but when it comes to collecting World War I photography, another one that has a lot of value and is desirable are photographs of World War I Marines, mainly because there weren't a ton of them, right? There weren't a lot of them yet. The U.S. Marine Corps was still actually under command of the U.S. Army. They sometimes get mad if you say that, but it's completely true, because they were actually the U.S. Marines were under the 2nd Army Infantry Division, so they had their own brigade inside the 2nd Infantry Division of the Army. So what makes them so unusual is, number one, photographs of them wearing their division patches, their photographs of World War I soldiers wearing patches is one of the most collectible things. You will have people like myself who collects photographs of just guys wearing 79th Division patches, because that's my interest because of my great-grandfather. Then you have guys that just collect Marine stuff, and what's fun about the Marine ones is every single Marine brigade had different colors to designate what patches they were, and all kinds of oddball different patches, and there's rare ones and this and that, so that becomes like a huge collecting thing. Marine uniforms were different, so you had that as well. And then sometimes you get some really unusual photographs like this one. I have 2 of the same guy. Number one, the guy's Native American. Okay, he was a Native American Marine in World War I, so that's a double, right? That's a double thing in value. And then he had this photograph taken, in the photograph was mounted inside a cardboard photograph mount that was custom made with a Marine Corps insignia, which I've actually have seen a lot of Marine photographs, and this is actually one of the only ones that I've ever seen of this folder. I still have shown it to like other collectors that I know, and no one has any idea like who made it or where the heck it originated or what. But it's unusual. So you got all kinds of things. You have that, the fact that he's a Native American and he's a Marine, so you got like a lot of stuff that make this photograph extremely rare.
Do they have his name?
He is unidentified, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm trying to identify him. It shouldn't be. It's taken me a while, but like being the fact that he's Native American, you can narrow it down. But there actually were a bunch of Native Americans that fought in the U.S. military in World War I. So
Did they have citizenship?
Yeah, they did, to a point. Obviously, they were all on reservations at the time, and so there's a lot of weird stuff that happened with that, of course. This is another really unusual marine photograph that the photographer was clearly very talented and was able to do this by hand drawing this into the development process. It was just kind of crazy. This is very rare. This is the 5th Marine Regiment. You have 2 main combat regiments in World War I, 5th Marine Regiment and the 6th Marine Regiment. So 3rd Army, 3rd U.S. Army, 5th Marines, get the big Marine Corps insignia. Inside of it you have what was called the Indian Head, that is the 2nd Infantry Division. And then inside that is their mascot. And he is identified on the back to what company had him and everything. All written on the back of the photograph. Very, very cool. One of my favorites in my collection. And here's another Marine, very formal portrait. This is post after the war had ended. He got his campaign ribbons and such on, just a nice portrait. Another thing that was very new at the time were motorcycles, right? So the U.S. Army were using official U.S. Army motorcycles. They were contracted with Harley Davidson and Indian, the 2 big ones, at the time, and they were being utilized all across the board. And so I was like, hey, this is cool. I want my photograph taken with a motorcycle. And they would have these actually taken. Now, a lot of times, these were not obviously taken in the studio, right? So they would actually make it look like this. This photograph is very well done. This is actually taken outside with a fake backdrop, but you can see the dirt here, right? Yeah. So there's a really cool dispatch writer. And then here's another one that was taken, and that's actually my great uncle again that we saw in the beginning. This is him. This was taken in France. Another thing that's fun is that, you look for like oddball details in collecting photography, and one of them that interests me is tattoos. They were very popular during World War I. You can see here, this sailor has a very traditional, patriotic sailor tattoo that were really popular in the 19-teens. I had found out later on, I never knew this, my dad never knew this, and all my uncles, I had 7 uncles, and no one ever knew that their grandfather actually had a tattoo on his forearm. And I found this out because in one of his military documents during the beginning of World War II, when you had the early 1942 draft, they were sending draft cards out to World War I veterans, right? And they were like, yeah, this guy obviously can't go in. My great-grandfather at the time was in his 50s. But on the back of the photograph it says, is there any identifying things on his body? And it says he has an anchor tattoo on his forearm. And I said that to my dad, and I'm like, did you know he had this tattoo? And he's like, I had no idea. He always wore long sleeves all the time. So, but he actually, I have no idea where he got it, but I believe it actually had nothing to do with his service in World War I, but actually because he actually worked for the Naval Aircraft Division at the Philly Naval Yard. Okay, and we're going to wrap it up here soon. Yeah. Another really fascinating photograph that you're just not going to. This is rare, and I have 2 of them that I found separate from each other, taken by the same photographer, and I have not been able to find. Only found another reference to one of these images being archived in an archive museum in New York City, and this is taken by a photographer. His last name was Alva, and you can see here his copyright. This was taken in Harlem, New York, in 1918, and in handwritten down here it says "They fight for humanity." And this is a very pro-African American image showing like, hey, these guys are fighting too for our for the world, and it was like a very this obviously this photographer was incredibly good. Okay, this is a photograph taken in his studio, taking up, this guy's pretending to be wounded. This is a nurse that's taking care of him, and he's, looking out. Look at these little, see the little nurses, like they're in the field? It's a battle scene. The photograph is amazing. There's another image where he's actually laying on the ground, and it's kind of like similar. I've been trying to research the heck out of these, and there isn't a ton of information, but I found out where his photograph studio was, and he was definitely an artistic photographer, right? He did some other photographs of some famous people in Harlem at the time. It's a great image. Another photograph of African Americans in World War I is another very collectible subject, and these guys were both in that division that I was talking about.
Fantastic trigger discipline.
Yeah, look at him. And then sometimes you'll find very formal portraits of decorated soldiers. This guy was actually from Philadelphia. He served in the 79th Division. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. There's his Victory Medal, and right there is his Distinguished Service Cross, which is the medal step down from Medal of Honor. And he had quite a story of how he had acquired that medal. Okay, and the last photograph here, I always end with the same. This is also another formal portrait of my great-grandfather, and this was taken right before he went over to France. And he was an interesting guy because he had a severe wound that had occurred when he was in France. His unit was actually in the trenches, and soldiers it wasn't uncommon for them to volunteer. There was chaos going on, and they were trying to get wounded soldiers out of the trenches to some of those ambulances. And he had volunteered to do that and go into the ambulances and ride with them to help transport. And while they were transporting to one of the field hospitals that was set up in a bombed out building, they actually hit a German landmine. And the ambulance, it blew off the axles of the ambulance. All three guys in the ambulance were killed, and he was thrown through the windshield of the ambulance into a tree and had a fracture in his skull. And they thought that he was going to die. They transported him to the field hospital, and they actually put him in the ward of a guy that was probably not going to make it. In his words, he was conscious of what was occurring around him, but not fully awake, right? So he knew that he had to try and make some sort of movement with his hands to let the nurses know that he was fighting and that he was still okay, like that. So he talked about how he was trying to move his thumb. He was trying all day, the days to move his thumb, and he did. And they recognized it. They transported him to another hospital. They actually did brain surgery on him in the field in France, and he recovered. Wow. He was in the hospital for about 2.5 months, and then got sent back to his unit right before they got sent back home from France. And then he comes home, and he married my great-grandmother before they went overseas. So then he comes back, and he has 12 children. Oh my gosh. And he lived until 1984. He was 94 years old, and was one of the smartest guys. He actually developed patents for the Navy at the shipyard in Philadelphia for the first catapult systems on a aircraft carrier. Wow. So that's the story that I was told that got me really interested in World War I, and I was like, man, that's really cool. So that is my presentation, and just collecting photographs. Anybody can do it. I find them. People ask, where do you find all these photographs? And luckily, my most prized possession photographs are the family ones, of course. But I find most of my photographs, at auctions, on eBay, flea markets, military shows, and then once you get into the circuit, like I've been doing it long enough, I know most of the major collectors in the country, and usually we're kind of have a friend group, and they go, oh, well, Ryan likes this, so if they find it, they'll sell it or trade it to me, and I'll get them stuff that they're looking for.
Nice.
So it just becomes a thing, and just like collecting anything, it becomes,
Obsession.
an obsession. Exactly.
Ryan, thanks so much for
but yeah.
sharing these with us tonight. The library is closed, so we can't take questions at this time, so